Welcome to HR Studio Podcast. Through bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond, we invite you to listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com.
So welcome everyone to HR Studio Podcast. My name is Fred Bunsa. I'm going to be your host for today's episode, and I'm thrilled to have Oscar Trimboli with us here today. All the way from, Oscar, tell the folks where you're hailing from.
G'day. Right now I'm in Sydney, Australia, the smoky capital of the world, walking around the streets in a white shirt for the last couple of days. I feel like smoked salmon. We've got a lot of bushfires on at the moment, so a lot of people are struggling with that.
Awesome. Well, Oscar is a unique guest because he's on a quest, and he's on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners. So today's podcast, we're going to focus on deep listening, what it is and how do you create it. That wasn't always Oscar's primary business and professional mission. He started as a marketing director for Vodafone and Microsoft, where he listened to a lot of customers over many years and then helped translate some of what he heard into leadership practices for Microsoft as well. And of late, he's focusing completely on this mission to build 100 million deep listeners. So Oscar, it's wonderful to have you on HR Studio Podcast.
I'm looking forward to having a great discussion and listening to your questions, Fred.
Great, and I will be listening to you as well. Here's a copy of Oscar's book that's out now called Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words. And it comes actually with a complete kit of playing cards. Maybe at the end of the podcast, Oscar, you can explain to us a little bit about that. But here's what I was thinking. Deep listening, we all think we're good listeners. We all want to claim that we are good listeners. But there's a lot that goes into it, a lot of focus. And your book goes into a number of those things, the 5 ways of listening. But I want to think about our audience of rising HR leaders. We go through this annual process around listening to our employees, our employee engagement survey. And I'm just wondering, is there deep listening that can happen, should happen, or does happen there in employee engagement surveys?
Yeah, I think annual employee engagement surveys are a great example of hearing. Deep listening is continuous. Deep listening is everyday conversations. And if we wait for the end of year employee engagement survey to listen to our staff, I think we've missed the point completely. And the biggest frustration I hear from employees as I do a lot of road shows with employee engagement software providers and working with leadership teams, the difference between hearing and listening is the action you take. So Fred, I'm going to be completely controversial and say stop doing employee engagement surveys until you implement what your employees asked you to implement on the last employee engagement survey and the one before that and the one before that.
Okay.
There's a very high likelihood that leadership teams haven't implemented the top 3 asks from employees on the last engagement survey. And the easiest way to get people to fill in an engagement survey is not to put up balloons and cakes and send out emails reminding them of what they should do in the employee engagement survey. If you actually implement what they ask you to do, you'll be shocked. Your participation rate will go up and so will your engagement score. The difference between hearing and listening is taking action. So my wish for the world when it comes to employee engagement is make it a continuous process, not an annual process. Modern providers of engagement surveys now have tools that will engage employees on a life cycle basis. They'll engage employees in common cohorts around particular issues on a very regular basis. I know some clients are doing it even weekly. But nothing replaces those magic moments where you just bump into one of your employees and you take the time not only to listen to what they have to say, but to act on what they have to say. And we've all heard the Gallup surveys about people leave their manager not the organization. Well, the number one reason why people leave their managers, if you double click into the Gallup data, is they don't listen to me. That's what employees say consistently. And whether you're losing good employees or losing great customers, it's usually as a result of a lack of listening.
And when people say, "I just don't feel like I'm being heard," is that get to the heart of what you're talking about in deep listening, or is that another issue?
I'd say it's a completely different issue. I mean, some of the most fundamental things around listening are managers who don't turn up to their one-on-ones, or they don't return employee calls, or they don't respond to emails. It's pretty basic hygiene when it comes to management.
Mhm.
And you would think that that would be management 101. Forget leadership 101. Just engage and reply. But as I've worked with market research providers and employee engagement suppliers around the world, as they want to tap into what's the difference between hearing on the engagement survey and listening and taking action, deep listening is understanding what the employees haven't said. It's understanding what they mean rather than only what they say. So, listening a little bit more deeply, you really understand what's behind it. And for a lot of people, just filling in a survey form is just not going to capture the essence of what it means. You need to have ongoing, continuous dialogue to make a difference there. Deep listening, as compared to, say, active listening is trying to make sense of something for you. You're trying to understand what they're saying. Deep listening is helping the speaker, the employee, understand what they mean. And for a lot of us, we don't understand this simple rule of listening. I speak at 125 words a minute, yet I can think at 900 words a minute. So the likelihood the first thing out of my mouth or what I type into a keyboard the first time is what I actually mean. There's an 11% chance, Fred, that what I say is what I mean the first time. So deep listening is listening to those other 700 words that are not said. And if we go and tap into that, we'll have an impact much faster when it
Wow.
comes to engaging employees.
So active listening is about me understanding um, what they're trying to get to, me making sense of what they're saying. And what
Mm.
you're proposing in your book, Deep Listening, is that what the activity could often or should often be about is helping them understand and articulate what they really mean.
And done well, if you ask them what else, tell me more, or just pause and use silence in that moment, in that dialogue, what you'll often find is they'll use code words like, you know what, Fred, what we should be talking about is, or Fred, actually, what matters the most to me right now is, or they'll just draw in a deep breath, they'll sigh, what we should be talking about is. Now, that's easy to do in a real-time two-way dialogue. It's a little bit harder to do in an employee engagement survey, but here's one of the tips that many anthropologists have actually explained to me. These are people who study cultures across histories, across continents, across languages. If the employees aren't part of constructing the survey, meaning
Mm.
they understand what the questions mean because they help to construct them. A lot
Right.
of employees struggle with employee engagement surveys because they don't actually know what the question means. Yet, if you want to increase participation rate, engage the employees in creating the questions. If you talk to anthropologists, they'll say, from an anthropological point of view, it's completely nuts. It's crazy. It's inconsistent with the science to compare cultures or organizations. Yet a lot of leaders spend a lot of time trying to benchmark themselves in employee engagement surveys as industry peers or like-size organizations or organizations on the East Coast. And the science will tell you that cultures are unique. They're a construction of that group of people at that point in time dealing with that issue. So, to get employees to speak their mind and what they mean when it comes to collecting data in a survey, get them involved. in creating the survey rather than just using a standard survey that's industry-wide with a bunch of questions that are consistent.
Well, so they can actually shape the questions in language that will theoretically resonate and be clearer to the people taking the survey, their peers, their
Yeah,
colleagues.
Fred, it's the second part of that. It's their language. As long as it makes sense to them, they can respond in a way that makes sense to them as well.
Interesting. Is there ever a point that you need to stop listening to somebody?
Yes, absolutely. And a really good example of this is leadership listening to us. Um, there comes a point where you start to hear themes consistently, no matter how many more meetings you have. And it's at that point that you have to stop listening and start to take action. A conversation becomes unproductive when it's repetitive. A conversation becomes unproductive when we're not making progress. So, as important as active listening is, as important as deep listening is, there comes a point in time where the themes are recurring and you need to decide the action plan. And that's the moment where you need to stop listening, because too much listening is just as frustrating as too little listening. So I can remember a time where, way back in my Microsoft days, I'm going back nearly 11 years now with this example, but we were hearing themes for the second year in a row in customer survey data. And it was simply saying this: the way you write things on the website doesn't make sense, and it doesn't help us solve the problem. So our team just simply went into the contact center and started to listen to the language the customers were using on the calls. And after probably 3 days of listening, that was the time to stop, because the patterns were really clear. We were using too much sophisticated, complex technology language, and we needed to simplify that. And that was the moment to stop listening, go and work with the website people and go and change what was written on there so people could actually use it. So there's often just as important, Fred, to stop listening as it is to start listening.
I guess the question becomes, the leadership question really becomes, is what is that crossover point? Where is that line that the data coming in is not providing anything new? Because you never know when a new golden nugget's coming in. So I don't know. Do you have a sense of how you would advise people when when there's enough listening tours done?
Yeah, the two components of that. One, you need to plan the listening tour deliberately. You need to get a cross section of the organization, not just geographically or in organizational hierarchy,
Right.
but also in the kinds of problems that employees are trying to solve. So, the Fred, what you'll notice really quickly is, no matter where you go, and I would typically say a 90-day period for the kinds of organizations that are over 1,000 employees, a 90-day period is the kind of period you're going to have to get to start to hear the issues and start to pattern match. After 90 days is a very high likelihood that the patterns will become consistent and the outliers won't be there as much. But
Okay.
again, I want to make the point is, listening tours to me are a complete waste of time unless they're continuous. So
Mhm.
too many organizational leaders do the listening tour when they start in the organization or when they're about to propose a change. Skillful leaders always have their ear to the ground. Their listening tour is consistent. And a listening tour doesn't have to be you physically getting on the plane all the time. A listening tour can be something as simple as using an internal enterprise-based social media site to pose questions to the organization. A
Mhm.
good leader will pose questions in those contexts. So you're getting continuous input. Some world-class leaders who operate in organizations of multi-tens of thousands, it's very difficult for them to do physical listening tours consistently. But using internal social media as an example, they get 8 times more engagement on a post that poses a question about a problem the leader is struggling with and asking the organization to help solve that. It also gives permission for all the employees that engage on that site to pose their own questions and what they're struggling with as well.
Yeah, it
So
makes it
listening,
okay to ask questions and not just have answers as a leader.
yeah, and I think for a lot of leaders, it relieves the pressure of being the person who knows it all and has all the answers, because they don't. And I often say when I lead workshops, the answer's in this room more likely than it is coming from me. And great leaders are skillful in asking the right kinds of questions. I remember there was a big telecommunications company that this study had been done on how they use internal social media. And somebody posed a question about how do we give credits to existing customers who've had a problem with international roaming. And everybody put up a bunch of responses, and somebody simply said the leadership team would never allow it. The CEO came and on that post and said, well, I'm on the leadership team. Have you asked me if I'd allow it? And that's a beautiful example of listening to what's unsaid in your organization through
Mhm.
these great tools that help you listen at scale.
Can you take us through the briefly, take us through the 5 levels of listening?
The 5 levels of listening are listening to yourself, listening to the content, listening for the context, listening for what's unsaid, and ultimately listening for meaning. And that's helping them make sense of what they mean rather than you figuring out what that means.
Okay.
For most of us, we struggle at level 1 listening to ourselves because we turn up to conversations with the last meeting in our head or the next meeting in our head,
Yep.
or something we're struggling with at home. In our database, Fred, of 1,410 listeners, we know 86% of people have said consistently, I'd love to get to level 2, but right now I'm completely distracted at level 1. I'm distracted by cell phones, I'm distracted by laptops. And if there's 3 simple things I'd say to everybody if you want to move from a distracted listener to a deep and impactful listener: 1, remove distractions; 2, notice your breathing; and 3, drink a glass of water in every conversation. Those 3 simple tips help double your listening productivity straight away. But most of us are addicted to our cell phones, we're addicted to our laptops or our iPads. And if I could get the world just to focus on one thing, just turn the notifications off if you're addicted, and then slowly move into flight mode, and then eventually switch that device off. There was a leader I worked with at Microsoft. It was 2012. He'd flown from Seattle to Sydney, effectively a 24-hour flight. I was hosting a meeting with him and 20 other CEOs of technology companies. And Peter ran a business that was about $5 billion. He was a pretty busy guy. He was responsible for about 25,000 employees. He sat at the front of the room. I'd introduced the purpose of the meeting. And then he stood up, and I thought, oh no, where's this going? Peter stood up. He turned to everybody in the room. He apologized. He said, look, the most important thing I can give you right now is my attention. And with that, he switched his cell phone off. He walked to the corner of the room, put it in his bag, and came back to the table. Now, Fred, what do you think happened with the other 20 people in the room in that moment?
They thought about, shoot, am I going to need to do the same thing?
Yeah, so what was interesting, 17 people switched their phones off and put them in their bags, and 3 people probably put them into flight mode. But in role modeling, giving attention in that moment, that meeting was completely transformational. In fact, those 20 CEOs have all gone on to different companies, but I know they meet every 6 months. Most times there's 6 or 7 of them, and they all do what they call the Peter thing. And they start the meeting by switching off the cell phones and saying, the most important thing we can do right now is give each other our full attention. So it's those basic things that a lot of us just miss because we think we're too important. And fine, if you run an organization that's bigger than a couple of $1 billion and you run an organization bigger than 10,000 employees, sure, use your cell phone. I don't understand what pressures you're under. But if Peter could do that traveling halfway around the world on a different time zone, I'm sure the rest of us mere mortals probably could as well.
One of the things that you say in the book is that in this current sort of moment of life that we're in right now, that listening matters in leadership more than ever. And so I think about our audience of HR leaders, and all kinds of leaders actually, but HR leaders who are often coaching other leaders. And I'm just wondering, how would you coach these coaches about communicating how important it is to these C-suite leaders to listen, and how do they actually help them listen more deeply?
I think going into a conversation and telling a leader that listening matters completely lacks empathy for what's their world problem and what they're all about. These people are struggling with really big commercial issues. They're struggling with declining revenues or declining market share, or they're struggling with intensity in competition, or they're struggling with great talent leaving the organization, or they're struggling with projects running behind schedule, or they're struggling trying to coordinate a global supply chain. I think if we put listening in the context of commercial impact, you'll get the attention of these leaders much more than walking in and saying, hey, Fred, today we're going to focus on listening. And if you want to see someone disconnect really quickly from a conversation, start with that phrase, because they're going to go, you don't get me. You don't get my problems. So I think for a lot of us that provide support services to these leaders, it's really critical to enter the conversation through their problem sets. And most commercial problems, losing market share is an inability for us to listen to our customers or our prospects. Losing great employees, an inability for us to listen to what they say. Projects that are running over schedule, projects that are running over budget, they're all a result of lack of listening. Imagine we are on the other side of that conversation though, Fred. There will be one thing that I would say is helping leaders to understand that the first thing people say, there's an 11% chance of what they say is what they mean. So the one tip I would say, if you're supporting leaders in this context, help them with this question. And the question is, pick either of these three things. Whenever somebody has described a problem, simply say, tell me more.
Tell me more.
Or ask them to say, what else?
Okay.
Or simply pause. Be comfortable with the silence. In the East, silence is a sign of wisdom. It's a sign of authority. And in that pause, or in that what else, or in that tell me more moment, the counterpart that the leader was working with, they'll become comfortable in saying, you know what? Actually, what I should be talking to you is about this. And that's where the real conversation is. If all leaders did was say, tell me more or what else, they would double their listening productivity immediately. But more importantly, employees would feel much more comfortable going to the heart of the issue much faster than waffling along with lovely elongated stories. The biggest fear of leaders, and the ones I work with, is the fear they're being told what they think they need to be told rather than truth. And the quickest way for leaders to get to the truth and really listen deeply is simply explore what else, tell me more, or just pause for 10 seconds and you'll see silence do the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, I love that phrase. Let silence do the heavy lifting. And we
And
had
it's not my phrase. It's a phrase by Judith Glazer, a wonderful leadership consultant in this space, and written a brilliant book called Fierce Conversations. Definitely one I'd recommend.
I know it well. It's a great book. We just have a few minutes left. Tell us about the cards that come along with your book, Deep Listening Cards, Impact Beyond Words. An application or two that you think could be helpful there?
Yeah, the cards have been used by school principals. They've been used in prisons. They've been used by police forces. They've been used in financial services. Some people just use one card a week. There's 50 cards organized into the 5 levels of listening, 10 cards at each level. Some leaders simply use that one card a week and give it to a buddy and say, I'm working on this in my listening this week. Can you help me with it? Some people use it in team meetings. And say, hey, the theme for this month, we're gonna listen more contextually than we have at the content. And an example of this is a sales organization I was working with. We're using listening at the context level, and that helped them break through on a couple of sales that they were blocked on. And for 3 of them, they made progress. But more importantly, for 2 of them, they decided they weren't the right organization to solve this problem and moved on. They recommended another supplier to that organization, which actually increased trust. And as a result, the customer said, we've got another problem over here. Might you be able to help us with that? So sometimes just simply using the cards in sales meetings, we've had it used in product engineering meetings where people are trying to listen for the unspoken needs of a customer. So there's many applications, but they're 3 that are the most common uses of it, Fred.
Awesome. Well, Oscar, we're going to need to wrap up. Any final thoughts from you on advice for our audience of rising HR leaders, and what would you like sort of resounding in their ears at the end of the podcast here?
Just remember that 125-900 rule. We think 900 words, we speak at 125 words. Just go and explore what's unsaid when it comes to your leaders. But for you individually as practitioners, number 1, remove the distractions. Number 2, the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. So just take 3 deep breaths before you go into any meeting. And if you're struggling with a topic, just take a deep breath in that moment. And then water, a glass of water in every meeting. A hydrated brain is a listening brain. The more blood sugars you can get to the brain, the simpler listening will be. And we unpack a lot of these at listeningmyths.com, Fred. So if people want more information, that's the best place to get it.
Awesome. Well, Oscar, thank you so much for your time today. For those of you who are not subscribers already to HR Studio Podcast, you can go to hrstudiopodcast.com and get the show notes for this episode. You can get all the access to Oscar and his website and all his social handles. We'll have those all listed there. And Oscar, again, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really helpful. Such a basic topic, but so fundamentally important to get right. And we really appreciate the research and the guidance you've given us.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the HR Studio Podcast. To download complimentary resources from this week's episode and to catch up on past episodes, please visit hrstudiopodcast.com. Subscribe to the HR Studio podcast list and social channels while there to receive alerts and recaps on all our episodes. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates. For over 35 years, AJO has built its reputation on experienced listening, exceptional quality, and caring partnerships, delivering in 30 states and 20 countries. To learn more and subscribe to AJO's Top 100 HR blog, visit us at ajoconnor.com.